Yes, so Wangare will help me admit. There are very many people trying to come in. So today's session, we are going to speak about a very important topic. And we're going to speak about how to peer review the conceptual framework, the research design, and the problem statement. So just a bit of a background, AIDA Africa, our main work is to provide research internship opportunities for upcoming researchers. So that's what we do. And we work with a pool of mentors. And this topic was a topic that was meant to be carried out by the mentors, mentor to mentor, where we sometimes do peer review. And we wanted to sharpen our skills on how to peer review certain areas of the research paper. So this session was meant for mentors, but then later today we thought, why not open it up to a few more people? So thank you for coming. We will have three amazing mentors speak to us today. We have Nancy Mwali, we have Collins Audi, and Nuria Fozia. So there'll be three of them. Each will present for 15 minutes. And then we will have a Q&A of 5 minutes. And so those are the topics we will address today. Please stay muted so that we can hear what they have for us today. And in the Q&A, you can either unmute or you can put your question on chat. And if you have any concerns, please put them on chat. And I'd like we can now start. So, Dr. Nuria, you're with us?
Yes, I am with you.
Yes, let me make you a co-host, and then you can share your presentation. You have 15 minutes, and Dr. will be looking at the problem statement, what we need to know about it, especially from even a researcher's perspective, but also from a peer reviewer's perspective. What do people actually look out for? So karibu sana Daktari, introduce yourself and take us there.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this session by AIDA Africa. My name is Dr. Fozia Noreen, a lecturer at Kaimosi Friends University, and honored to be here. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay. So while we are doing mentorship, we usually have a problem with why are you doing that research? What is the problem that you want to address? How do you make sure that your problem statement actually stands out and somebody can actually understand why you do that particular or why you're doing that particular problem statement? So the team decided that this would be a best way to start navigating the research scenario. So today I am going to start this particular topic with the problem statement. So looks like I need to get. The objectives are to understand a problem statement, also understand a problem tree. Sorry, there's a small typographical error. And then the summary of a problem statement and the must-haves in a problem statement. So what basically is a problem? This is a gap of what is and what ought to be. Where am I? Where should I be? And it can come in any way, a question, a matter, and you're basically trying to deal with a specific issue or a gap in existing knowledge. Even a theory, you want to change the theory, or you want to add or reduce or refute. That is a problem, and that is where you start. So a research problem is that. Now, having a topic, you can have a topic, but the question is, can you get a problem from a topic? For example, off the cuff, malnutrition in children in Africa. Fine. What about malnutrition and children in Africa? So what exactly is your problem? You want to now, you can get a topic from a problem, but it's very difficult to get a problem from a topic. So you need to start from there as you find out. So you can rephrase it and say, malnutrition among children under 5 years in the rural areas is high in comparison with children in the urban areas. That becomes, you're looking at a comparative study. So you need to know that particular area. You also need to have a very interesting topic, something that catches the supervisor's or the researcher's mind. What is unique about your problem? What value or what knowledge are you adding? It should also be in your area of interest or your area of specialization. Some of us go into research for the sake of research, but it has no important or there's no aspect in terms of, is it important to us? Is it relevant? Is it interesting? How original and creative is it? Everywhere you go, you're looking at organizational performance. Fine, what about organizational performance? So you need to be a bit creative with a number of things. Like right now, I would like to see a lot of artificial intelligence coming up because that is a new area and can cut across different scenarios. So what is the new areas, and that is how you want to look at your problem. Now, as you're looking at your problem, you also need to do a lot of reviews of literature. What are other scholars saying? Where are the gaps? And that is where you can also create that particular area. Now, criteria of a good problem, it should be clear and unambiguous, which means it should be clearly stated. Empirical verification, you can test it. It has facts. According to the data from the Auditor General, the 500 billion was lost in corruption. That is empirical verification, okay? Relationship between variables should be expressed. You should know what your independent variable is and what your dependent variable is and what is the relationship between there so that we know. You should avoid duplication. But on the other hand, your study can be replicated. For example, if a study was done in Nigeria and Kenya has the same characteristics, can the study be done? Can the results be the same? But if we don't have the same characteristics, then you expect different results. Interest and importance should also be there in terms of your research problem. Availability of guidance, you should have a lot of guidance in terms of authorities and your theoretical analysis. Experience and creativity should also be there. And then the nature and scope of your study will be determined by the level of the research. And undergraduate research will not be as much as an PhD research. For those who are doing PhD, you're looking at hypothesis testing, you're looking at answering questions among others. But for an undergraduate, you just may be answering questions and that is it. Your research should possess reasonable knowledge and necessary statistical data. There should be cooperation between maybe organizations or whatever that you're going to do the research on. Your research should be manageable. Please don't do research that is not manageable, and you should also be economical in terms of time and money. And then also understand your capabilities and your limitations, and then you'd be able to know that you have a good research in that area. Start with theories. It is easier to start. What theories are you looking at? And I usually find it very interesting in the business courses where I'm best. Everybody is looking at resource-based theory, and we have hundreds and thousands of theories. Look at that theory, add to it, bend to it, challenge it, and that is how you're adding knowledge to whatever is there. Also ensure that you have no bias and your research is safe and ethical. Be as objective as possible. And that is why we usually ask, how are you doing your sampling? If you're going to talk about purposive sampling, the question is why? Unless it is a CEO where it is one person, you would avoid this bias as much as possible. But then sometimes it has to be there, but you need to come out clear and say that there was bias because of 1, 2, 3, 4. So what should the problem statement have? Has the problem been specified? Has it been quantified? Is it too large? Is there availability of data? And am I capable of solving the problems? If you can answer these questions, then you know that you have some ground to start your research. But if you have not answered these questions yourself, then you're not ready to answer those research questions. Guidelines, opening statement. And this is where we all make mistakes. And we start with, according to a study done by Fauzier in 2022, that is wrong. Already you're quoting me at the start of the sentence, and as somebody who is coming to read it, I am not going to be held, it won't hold my, it won't pick up my interest. So you need a catch statement, a phrase that makes you want to read more. Nigeria is the largest country in Africa in terms of population, with the biggest, okay? So what next? I want to read more, I want to read more. So make sure that your opening statement has that catch statement, okay? What led to the problem? Why is the problem important? The key concepts being tested or explored. Consider numeric information. Those are the numbers, figures, they give an impact. And consider short sentences. Your problem statement should be a maximum of 1.5 pages, a minimum of 1/2 page, an average of 1 page. Anything beyond that, it loses its focus. Enough background information in the field of study. You need to have good literature and give indication of theoretical and practical guidance, and then develop testable hypotheses that will suggest or request further study or experience. And that is where your research gaps will come in at the end of your research problem. So the first thing of a research, broad area of research, preliminary data gathering. Third place is problem definition. Then you have your theoretical framework, hypothesis, research design, data analysis. If everything is no, you go back to preliminary. But if it is yes, then you go to report writing, presentation, and decision making. Now, sometimes when we are also doing research, and this is more now for non-academic research, we do the problem tree. For academic research, we would not do the problem tree so much, but for non-academic, we will do a problem tree. And I will talk briefly about the problem tree, which basically says you find solutions by mapping the effect, the cause and effect. So I'll be very brief there because my time is almost running out. So identify with the problem, organize and arrange the key problems, the root cause, etc. So underlying cause, what is happening? For example, let me just go straight to what is the key problem? You're looking at a broad condition. What is the underlying cause? A specific condition. The behavioral underlying cause or attitude, all that comes there. So you are able to take that particular scenario. So this is a sample. The big problem, inadequate nutritional status. What is the cause? Inadequate food intake and high prevalence rate of infectious diseases. If in inadequate food intake, we are looking at household level, we are looking at, so you can see that this, there are a number of activities that can actually cause those particular areas, and that is what causes the problem tree. So I'm not going to go into detail there so much. So I'll wind up as I'm saying, your problem statement should be concise and a summary of your research. Describe the exact issue your research will address, what we still need to know, the relevance of your problem to the current, why do we need to know more about that, set your objectives of the research, state who should do the research, explain the variables, and I basically summarize and say, understand the 6 wives and 1 husband. These are the what, the why, the when, the where, the who, the which, the how, and all with facts. What is the issue? Why is it there? When did it start? Where is it going? Who will do it? Which is the method? All those things you're going to look at, make sure you do it with. And as we wind up and I say, we cannot solve our problems with the same level of thinking that created them. A problem well stated is a problem half solved. A mathematical sum can be right, but only by going back till you find the error, working it afresh from that point, never by simply working on without correcting. the errors. Thank you very much. And I hope I impacted something to some of you, and these slides will be available to those who joined. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fozia, for that session. As we had indicated before, welcome the people who've joined us. As we had indicated before, this session was meant to be a mentor session. So that's why we are keeping that's why we are taking a short time, but we also recognize that we have people maybe right now they're writing their problem statement. So that's why you see it's quick, because it was meant to be a mentor session. But we now welcome questions. If you're working on your problem statement right now, what kind of feedback have you received about it? What is becoming difficult about it? Recently, I met, I'm doing a second master's in MBA Healthcare Management. And I was meeting my supervisor this week to talk about the problem I want to study. And we had all this discussion. Why are you studying it? At some point, he asked me, can you just make a phone call to the county and find out this information? And it actually occurred, one of the questions I had, I could have just made a phone call and have that information. So already that was something not really worth researching. So right now, open the forum for 5 minutes. Please put on chat any question you have around the problem statement. Something you're struggling with. Have you been told your problem statement is not well focused? Have you also, as Nuria has said, Dr. Nuria has said, have you read, have you consulted literature? Because it's very hard to craft a problem statement from literature that you have not well understood. Because remember, in research, we are building up from the people who went before us. So for you to be able to carve out that issue, that gap, we have to know what has gone before us, and then where am I now coming in this topic so that I can make a contribution. So welcome. Let me see if we have any questions on chat. Thank you. I've seen people introducing themselves. Let's know who is here. I know we have people from all over Africa, so that is great. So we have a question from Isaiah. How exactly, so Nuria, you can just pick some of these questions. How exactly do we present a problem statement? Is there any formula? So for you, Nuria, and in research, we really don't have formulas. All you have to do is just make sure you're justifying everything that you're doing. But I leave that to you, Daktari. How do we present that problem statement? You have told us it should not be more than 1.5 pages. Better if it's 1 page, even better if it's half a page. Karibu Outa. So another question from Paul. Is it right to use the funnel method in stating our problem? So I guess the funnel method is where we are coming from a more global perspective of the problem, a regional perspective, and then narrowing it down to the context that we want to study. So there is a question around, do we do that? Ali says the problem statement is no more than 1.5 pages for PhD research. Yes. Luis is asking, might you have an example of a problem statement? Excellent. Daktari, if you have an example of a good problem statement, it will also be nice to share. Sometimes we learn when we see what a good example looks like. So let me stop there so that you can take those questions. So we'll then come again for another round. So how do you present the problem statement? Do we use a funnel method? And do you have an example? Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I will start with Isaiah. How do we present a problem statement? A problem statement should have an impact, and it is in prose form. There's no formula for it, but it should have those must-haves. So you need to be able to answer those questions in such a way that whoever reads it can be able to understand why do you want to do that research. So that is the first thing that you need to do. So the formula is not there. It is more of understanding. It is more like the more you do it, the better it becomes. In terms of using the funnel approach in a problem statement, we don't go global, regional to local. We hit it on with facts. That is more on the background to the study. That is where we use the funnel approach for that particular scenario. The problem statement is not more than 1.5 pages for PhD. That is across the board. It is not just for PhD alone, for all, even non-academic research. You should not have a problem statement that is more than 1.5 pages. Then it loses its impact. Might I have an example of a problem statement? Yes, I would, but not here. So maybe later on we can share on something, but not at the moment. How do I judge if a problem is genuinely a problem worth researching on? Number one is the gaps from the previous researchers. And that is why it's very important to read what others have done before. Where is the gap? And how are you able to close that gap? And some gaps come in as an emergency, like when we got COVID. That was a researchable thing because nobody had known about COVID, and we are looking at so many things that are changing. So the facts that are on the ground is what gives you that problem is worth researching. What is there in terms of data? What is there in terms of literature review? What is there in terms of theoretical understanding? Once that is done, then you would be able to know that the problem is worth researching. And that is where most of us go into a problem. We come up with a topic without reading what has been done before. Comment on the language of the problem statement and voice, active, passive tenses. In a proposal, a problem statement is usually in a future tense. It is actually active. In a final thesis, it is in past tense because you have done the research and you are explaining to us what has been done and why you did that. What happens to proposal written for funding and are meant to address current problems such as COVID-19, and finally the funds are released when the problem is not there or has already been solved? I wouldn't know how to answer that a little bit, because then that means that the funder lost touch. And if that happens, then there's a big problem with the funder themselves. And I'm sure you still have to give a report on the same. So that is something you'll need to work with the funder on the same as to why there was a problem in the release and the problem has already been solved. And I'm wondering how that problem can have been solved. So I think that is so far what I can respond to at the moment. And I think that's what I can respond to at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. And as we always say, this is a peer session. Yes. So we also invite you to share your tips, to answer any question that has been asked, so that we can also learn from you, because we believe also in peer-to-peer mentoring and learning. So I guess for the last question about the problem has been solved, I think, if I'm not wrong, research is not just about solving a problem. Perhaps the funding was for a particular issue to look for maybe a solution, but sometimes you can also do research to understand the problem from a different perspective, to help us have more in-depth understanding of certain dynamics that we may not have considered. So I think there's still an opportunity to maybe change the research questions. And if something like COVID, it may not be actively in the world, but look at the consequences it has had to different populations, to different sectors. Those are potential areas to go deeper and do studies and ask a different research question. So finally, is there anyone who wants to add something before we close that and then move to the conceptual framework?
Hello. Sorry.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, hi.
This is Saya Meli.
Yes, Saya.
Are you getting me?
Yes.
Yes. So I had an opinion.
Yes.
That when we have statement of the problem, is that we have the ideal situation. Then we have what is it that is happening now on the ground. Are you getting me?
Yes.
And then what will happen if we don't arrest the situation?
Mm-hmm.
Are you getting what I'm trying to say?
Mm-hmm.
That we have the ideal situation. What is it that is happening now, or what is the problem now? And then what will happen if we don't arrest this situation?
Mm-hmm.
That is what I have been reviewing of how to write a statement of the problem.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that is my
So,
contribution.
so maybe the ideal situation would be perhaps children don't have malnutrition,
Yes,
people are healthy, and then we now have a situation where children, maybe we have high mortality rates due to malnutrition. So, and why is that? So, is that how you mean? So you have the
yes,
ideal where we should be in terms of standard of health, but then we have a scenario where the reality is different, and then we
yes.
want to understand what are the drivers, what could be some of the intersecting issues that are leading to that. Is that what you mean?
That is what I mean exactly,
Okay,
madam.
thank you. Thank you, Isaiah. Ota, welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the presentation. One thing that I also want to bring to the attention is sometimes when you find students writing statement of the problem, they end up mixing justification inside the statement of the problem. So you find they're writing, this is the problem, and then there's this need to solve, or this research will come up with this. I think we need to make it clear that in this space, you are stating the problem. You are not trying to justify why there is need to solve it. So sometimes you find people mixing this. So because especially if you have, like in proposals where you have a specific section for statement of the problem and then a specific section for the justification, in the statement of the problem section, just state the problem and then go ahead in the separate section to justify why there is need and what your proposal is going to contribute towards solving the problem. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. So emphasis on justification of the problem in the problem statement is very critical, because someone will always ask you, so what then? I mean, what does this mean? And so it's very important to really justify. And the best way to justify in scholarly writing is through literature. Justify that through other people's work, reference other people's work, so that then that adds voice to your own voice. So I think we will close the chapter on problem statement there. The tip I can give for now is your research is not the world's best secret, kept secret. So even if you write a section of the problem statement, give it to 2 or 3 people to check it for you. Don't wait till you're handing your work to your supervisor and then your supervisor tells you it's not well focused. Give your colleagues, tell them, I have finished writing my problem statement. Tell me, can you understand what is the problem? Can you understand why am I doing this research? Can you understand how am I going to do it? So, and if your friends tell you, well, it's not very clear what you're really studying, then you have an opportunity to do that correction before you submit it to your supervisor. So in ADA Africa, we believe knowledge does not just rest with a supervisor, knowledge rests with all of us. So let your peers be your first reviewers whenever you have something you've written like a problem statement. So thank you very much. Now I'm going to invite Nancy Mwali to come and talk about the conceptual framework. This is an area where people also struggle with. And Karibu Nancy, let me make you a co-host so that you can share your screen. If you still have any questions, please put them down so that we can also have other sessions where we unpack a bit more some of these issues. Nancy, you're with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Let me make you, how have you saved your name?
Let me check, should just be Nancy.
Nancy, so that I can,
Yeah, Nancy Mwani.
okay. So you can be introducing yourself as I get your name. I see a Nancy Rika, that is not you. Let me, okay.
Yes,
You can
Nancy Mwali.
as I get your name.
Great. So my name is Nancy Mwali. Academically, I'm a student at St. Paul's University, pursuing PhD. And in practice, I work with Kilimanjaro Blind Trust Africa. My background is finance for both cases. So shall I just continue, Aurelia?
Yes, yes, continue. Let me just, okay, I got it finally. Sorry about that. You're now a co-host. You have a presentation, you can share your screen.
There we go. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Can you see my screen, Aurelia?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Go on. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Good evening, everyone. I'd already introduced myself. I'm a student of a PhD student at St. Paul's University. And in practice, I work with Kilimanjaro Blind Trust Africa. My background is finance. So this evening, I'm going to share my experience and what I've learned so far about how to both develop and also review a conceptual framework, especially in the space where we are doing a lot of peer review, peer-to-peer review, because we find that sometimes the mentors and our lecturers and all these people may not always be available for us. So the space where AIDA Africa has provided is for us to be able to have peer-to-peer review and learn from each other. So in brief, I will describe the conceptual framework as a diagrammatic representation of the relationships between that you expect to see between variables that are significant to your research or to your study. All right. So the variables that you've already identified that are key to your study, we want to see how are they related, which are these variables and how are they related. So those ones, you can describe them probably in chapter 1. But then again, when you have a diagrammatic representation of the same, that is what we call the conceptual framework. So just a few items to look out for. You have to have your research topic, or in this case, we'd also call it a research question, where when you look at your research question, you have to identify which are your independent variables and which are your dependent variables. So that's very, very key to flesh that out from the topic. If you're not able to see that from the topic, then we have a problem, because how will you then develop your conceptual framework? Then you also have to look out for the cause and effect relationship in the variables. What affects what, how, and why? And then you also have to identify other intervening variables if you are going to have them in your study. That they don't have to be there. It depends on the level, whether it's master's or PhD, but it will always be good for you to identify those early in advance before you even decide to even draw up the conceptual framework. So now, in the process of identification of the study variables, you have to identify, we already said you have to identify the independent variable and the dependent variable. Then we also have the moderator and mediator variables. Time allowing, we'll be able to look at that at the end. But then I'll use an example, or I'll use examples. That way it sinks better and you understand better. For example, if you have a topic like the effect of bank characteristics on profitability of listed commercial banks in Kenya, I've highlighted bank characteristics and profitability. Bank characteristics, yes? Bank characteristics being our identified independent variable, and profitability being the dependent variable in our case. So the dependent variable is always the problem variable, the problem that you're trying to solve in your study. And the independent variable is the explanatory variable, the variables that are being used to resolve the problem in your study. So once you're at that stage, the next stage is to identify the constructs that will be used to explain both variables. Ideally, you'd have 2 or 3 of them. And these then, when you're formulating your objectives, these would form the key variables as you're developing the objectives of the study. I'll give an example. Then, of course, the construct in this case, we'll just define it as the abstract idea or an underlying theme or subject matter that you wish to measure using the subconstruct. I will give an example so that we see what those are. And then also, for example, back to our example of the topic. The sample topic was the effect of bank characteristics on the profitability of listed commercial banks. So when you go into conceptualization of these study variables, you'll see that under bank characteristics, what are the constructs that would then be discussed, even as you're discussing, you're fleshing out your literature review, as you're looking at your theories and other things. You look at, example, in this case, under bank characteristics, we have 3 characteristics that I've identified: the bank size as the first construct, the capital adequacy, and the liquidity. Sorry, I will use financial examples because that is my background, but as we are discussing this, just think about your topic, your study, and try and look at some of the constructs that you'll be looking out for. Then, of course, we have put under the bank size, we have gone down to put, this would be then loosely put maybe the formulas, which in this case we are calling subconstructs, which would be used as measurements for bank size. In this case, if you're doing a quantitative study, like myself, in terms of finance, mostly it will be quantitative study, then you'll be expected to use the formulas that will be able to measure the bank size. Then, of course, the capital adequacy, we have the examples there. Those will be the sub-constructs and sub-constructs for the bank characteristics as our independent variable. Similarly, you will also have the dependent variable. In our case, in our example, it will be the profitability, where we also have the measurements of how we will measure profit. Are we going to use the return on assets or return on equity? And then in that case, similarly, you also have to use the subcontract, which would be what will be used to measure the construct, the return on asset or return on equity. Then the other important thing would then be to link our study variables to the objectives. This would be very useful. Remember, I talked about how do we then go ahead to formulate our study objectives once you've identified your variables. The general objective in our example would then be, the main objective of this study is to evaluate the effect of bank characteristics on profitability of listed commercial banks in Kenya. Because we're talking about variables, we'll focus on bank characteristics and profitability. Remember earlier, we already fleshed out what are the constructs of bank characteristics. We have 3: bank size, capital adequacy, and liquidity ratio or liquidity. So these are some of the examples of how you can formulate your study objectives, your specific objectives, to be able to ensure that your constructs are very consistent with your topic as you had identified them earlier. So you will see that we have 4 study objectives, and each one of them is carrying the constructs, the 3 constructs that as had been identified. And of course, profitability is very consistent in each one of them because it is our problem variable. It is the dependent variable. It is bank size. Profitability depends on bank size. Profitability depends on capital adequacy. Profitability depends on liquidity ratio or liquidity. So that is why we are saying that profitability is our dependent variable and the other 3 are our independent variable. Then quickly, if we look at what are those things that we'll be looking out for as we are reviewing our conceptual framework, either you're reviewing your own or you're doing a peer review for your colleague, or you're just reviewing someone's study. One, you have to identify the problem variable. Which one is it, the dependent variable? If you cannot tell which is which, then there's an issue there. So you have to identify which one is the problem variable and which one is the explanatory variable. Then there should be constructs that are used to measure these variables, because you have to be able to measure. Because if you're not able to measure, you're going to encounter problems, especially when you're developing your tools and when you're doing chapter, in my discipline, it should then be chapter 4. When you're doing the measurements of variables, how are you going to be measuring these variables? Then there should also be some constructs, which are also used, come in very handy when you're measuring that. And it's very useful when you're doing data analysis. And then the constructs and subconstructs will make the body of the rich discussions in the literature review. Because once you've identified your variables, if you don't identify your variables correctly, what are you going to be discussing in chapter 2, in the literature review? What kind of journals and books and materials are you looking out for to discuss in chapter 2 in the literature review? So that's why you have to get those ones correctly. Then the arrows on the conceptual framework have meanings. They should not just be heading to different directions. They have meanings. It goes ahead to support the explanation of how they're related. So the other one is that, of course, that's the main final one as we are closing, how to review. You ensure that the constructs as presented in the conceptual framework are linked to the topic, the research objectives, the research questions, and if you're using hypotheses, you should link them to the hypothesis, the literature review, as when you're discussing, as I'd mentioned, as well as theories and models that you're going to choose, they have to be relevant to the variables. And ultimately, the research tool, the questionnaires. If you don't get the variables correctly, and if they're not linked all the way from the topic to the models and the literature review, then what questions are we going to be asking in the questionnaire? So most importantly, all this must be aligned, otherwise the study will not have a logical flow. So I just have an example of a conceptual framework based on everything that I have just discussed earlier. We do have the characteristics on our left as the independent variable and the profitability on the right. And then we have the constructs which are bank size, capital adequacy, and liquidity, and how they'll be measured. And that is how we formulate our objectives, linking the relationship between independent variables, which is characteristics, and the profitability. And then we have another one that we've introduced here, time allowing, we shall discuss, but for now it's asset quality. Maybe just to sum up in another minute or so, in a causal relationship between the two variables, for example, if you have hours of study and exam scope, that is just an example away from the finance examples. We have other relationships or other variables that could affect a relationship between hours of study and the exam score. Meaning, if you study more, you're likely to have a higher exam score. However, we do have other variables that may affect this relationship. I'm going to highlight two of them. We have the moderating or the moderator variables, which regulates the relationship between the two. In our case, the hours of study and the exam score. So giving an example of a moderating variable or a moderator variable, we'll talk about the IQ, which can be introduced in this case. So when you introduce the IQ, we are asking, does IQ affect the relationship between the hours of study and the exam score? We are saying, if you have a higher IQ, does it affect that relationship? Or if you have a lower IQ? So that's just an example of a moderator variable. Simply put, no matter how many hours of study you put in, your IQ will not be affected by your IQ level. Sorry, your score will not be affected by your IQ levels, which will affect the exam score. Sorry, I'm just mixing myself here. Simply put, no matter how many hours of study you put in, your IQ will not be affected, but your IQ levels will affect the exam score, okay? The other one that would affect the relationship between the IV and the DV would be the mediating or the mediator variables. And they simply helps to explain the relationship between the two and how they affect each other. So for instance, back to our hours of study. Hours of study affect the passing of cuts, if you have cuts in between, which in turn affects the exam score. So here we've introduced the cuts. We're not talking about the IQ anymore. We are saying if you put in hours of study and then add the passing of cuts, will that enhance the exam score? Okay, so the number of cuts passed is the mediator variable, meaning it is mediating, it is improving the quality of this relationship. By adding the mediating variable, there's an explanation of the cause and effect between these two variables. While both have an impact on the dependent variable, which in our case is a score. The main difference between the two is that the moderator variables, in this case, which is the IQ, is not affected by the number of cuts passed. So I will leave that at that point. That is the end of the presentation, but I'll close it by saying that ensure that you have you're very consistent with the variables that you choose at the beginning, right from the topic to the objectives, all the way to your literature and to your tools, without introducing new concepts and variables at different stages of the study. Do not interchange the words, especially those words that have synonyms. Even when you have synonyms, ensure that you use the same word consistently. So consistency is key in this case. Aurelia, back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for that presentation. As we said, we are keeping it short, and because we have 3 presenters today, so thank you for taking us through. We now open for question session. I had a question, Nancy, where when we are showing the relationships, is it based on proven literature, on proven evidence that they actually relate that way, or it is our own interpretation of that relationship? Because my understanding is also hypothesis has to be informed by literature. So when we're doing those relationships, when the arrows are going, is it really based on evidence that they're actually related? So that's my question. And there are a few more questions on the chat. Then we have Steven says moderating or moderator variable may also be referred to as the intervening variable. It seems it's a bit different from what you've explained, Nancy, but he's saying in the medical field, maybe in the medical field it's the same. Remember, disciplines also matter. Then Ali says, I have a question. I want to know the model of conceptual framework that follow this step. Antecedent, that is dependent, a variable, that is the outcome. Thank you so much. So Nancy, you can go to chat, see how that question is phrased. Ali. So like, for example, he says leadership is antecedent, which is the dependent, and adopting online platform is a independent variable. The outcome is profitability. What is this model called? How do you explain it? So Nancy, I would say just go to the question from Ali and just read it on your own so that it's a bit clear to you. Thank you, Ali. Then Luisa says, do conceptual frameworks apply to all disciplines? Do we all have to have a conceptual framework in our thesis? Okay, and so where does it apply? Where does it not necessarily apply? Thank you. Then Nuria says we have intervening, mediating, moderating variables, and they affect the conceptual framework. Thank you for that. Thank you for the presentation. People are appreciating. Caroline Migani says moderator, mediating. Are they all intervening variables? So I think there's some clarity you can give there about the variables: moderator, mediating, intervening. And Dr. Fozia says the variables will be on the evidence, but the relationship will be the researcher's own interpretation. Okay, so thank you. Nancy Marika says, I think antecedent variable is a variable that exists before the independent variables. It affects the independent variable. I'm telling you today, variables, it's a variable day. So thank you, Nancy, for that. Maybe you could unmute after Nancy Marika, you can unmute after Nancy speaks to just explain a bit that. Yeah, so there are more responses. Ruth is correcting, mediating intervenes, enhances the relationship between intervening, between independent and dependent variables. So Ruth, thank you for clarifying that. Amigani says, is it okay to have a conceptual framework and a theoretical base in one study? So do we have to have both of them there? Do we need one? And all that. So there are many questions, Nancy. So I'll just invite you to go on chat and see how you can just answer those you can for now, those you cannot. We will have a feedback form where once you share your feedback, we can also send some more materials and resources. So over to you, Nancy, to respond to some of those questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. I must have missed some of them, but I'll try and capture as much as possible and respond to as many as possible, especially those that are almost asking related questions. For instance, the conceptual framework, you remember in my discipline, which is business, specifically finance, conceptual framework is done in chapter 2. Chapter 2 is literature review and is done after literature review, meaning what validates the conceptual framework that you're presenting is the literature. It's not hypothetical, it's the literature itself. So once you have delved into literature and you have seen what the earlier studies are saying and the arguments are solid, then you draw your conceptual framework. So what I would say is that in terms of consistency, just make sure that whatever you're discussing is backed by literature. And that's the backbone of academia. You must back everything by literature. It cannot be hypothetical. And then the question was about the structure or the model of the conceptual framework that, for instance, the example I provided. You see, the purpose of the conceptual framework is to demonstrate the relationship between the variables. So this, if I could say, the example that I'm now projecting is actually an example from my own study, where this is how my variables are related. So from your whatever background or field you're coming from, look at how your variables are related, because how my conceptual framework is structured may not necessarily be how yours is structured. So just look at what do you want to say, because it is what you want to say, what you're saying in your objectives, what you're saying in literature, that you're just presenting it in a diagrammatic way. You're just putting it in a diagram. So that should be very consistent. Don't look at this one and say, this is the template. This is not the template. It's just an example of how it would look like, given the objectives I provided, the variables I provided, and the measurement I provided in this example. And then again, a lot of what the questions that were being asked, I would say, be very careful to be guided by the university guidelines, your university, your faculty, your discipline. Stay within that, because various universities guide differently in terms of structure, in terms of where they come, in terms of how you draw it. But I was just sharing the fundamental basics of what a conceptual framework is and how it should look like. and the variables that should be there and what should be discussed, the things that should not miss. If you have, for probably masters, it is not, I've seen most, while reviewing some documents, I've seen that the intervening, moderating, and those variables I could be missing. But for masters, you'll find that for you to bring out your arguments properly and just to erase any doubts that you have actually read and you've gone through all this, you fleshed out everything exhaustively, it would be nice to introduce, it doesn't look complete, almost doesn't look complete, especially in my field of study, in my area. The panelists, for instance, if you're in the defense, they want to see what are some of these other relations that could affect the in IV and DV that you have left out. And you don't want those to be pointed out at the defense. You want to have read and found out if there are any critical variables that may affect those two relationships. Let me look at the other question. Aurelia, if there's any that is there that I have not I looked at, because I think I'm being overwhelmed by just going through those. Is there any that have left out that is key? Let me see.
One for disciplines. Should everyone have a concept?
Not necessarily, but most studies do have conceptual frameworks. And because conceptual frameworks, a conceptual framework goes ahead to just bring a lot of clarity on how your variables are related. It sort of gives a summary, a snapshot, especially, for instance, when you're doing a presentation in your defense and you have 12 slides or maximum of 10, and you want to talk about your variables and how they're related. It will be good to have a conceptual framework so that you can only explain, as opposed to have two or three slides to explain how those variables are related and how they'll be measured. So again, I will go back to what the university guidelines provide in your specific universities, and also what your discipline dictates. Which field are you in and how is it done in your field? That will be very important, so that I don't guide you based on what my university and business field dictates or guides, and then we mislead each other in the process. So that's what I would say, Aurelia.
Thank you. And yeah, and for us who do more qualitative studies, we don't really have to use a conceptual framework, at least to the best of my knowledge. I haven't used any framework, but maybe you may have a theory that you can unpack and go more deeper into that. So there's someone who is asking maybe the last question, then we can have the last presenter. What is the meaning of the arrows?
Okay. The arrows, for instance, let me take an example of what I'm projecting. The arrows, it shows the relation. For instance, let me go back to the objectives. You see, let me take the first objective, to determine the effect of the bank size on profitability of listed commercial banks in Kenya. The two variables are bank size and profitability. Back to our conceptual framework. So we are looking at the relationship between independent variable and the dependent variable, which is the profitability. So the arrow shows the direction of the relationship. This is how it's going. And as it's heading towards profitability, like putting it very simply, we have another variable, which is a moderating variable. In my case, we are calling it the asset quality, which is going to affect the relationship between the bank size and the profitability. So without going into a lot of technical financial things, the arrows just goes, for instance, you can imagine if the arrow was facing the opposite direction, what are we communicating? And yet we've already identified the bank characteristics, which are the three, as the explanatory variables, and the profitability as the problem variables. So we're just showing that these are the answers that are going towards answering this question, which is our problem variable. and the asset quality is a moderating variable. Depending on your study and what as you're reading, you could have a moderating, mediating, intervening, and all that, as long as you explain how that affects that relationship. So the arrows are very important because they're showing the direction of how they're actually enhancing the explanation of how the two variables are related. Otherwise, if you put, for instance, this one, you put it this other side, you can imagine what you're communicating. You can actually fail that presentation. If it's a defense, it can go a long way in punching a lot of holes as to whether you actually understand what you're presenting altogether.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you. I've seen a lot of people are also helping each other.
Thank you, Aurelia.
Maybe I can add something small on the relationship. If you can look at that conceptual framework that Nancy has put there, you can see that we have the first set of arrows, which is moving from like the first objective to profitability.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where now you can start your hypothesis. The first one is from bank size, profitability, then bank size, asset quality, profitability. So that shows that that relationship is going through that particular angle. So those arrows mean something, and how they go, they'll be able to tell you the kind of relationship those variables have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Fozia, for that. And because at the end of the study, you have to conclude then, is there an effect of, is there cost effect of this? So I think that's why we really have to be careful about how we are moving the arrows, about the intervening variables, the moderating variables, so that if you're making the conclusion that indeed these bank characteristics have effects on profitability as a conclusion of your study, then it has to be very clear and accurate how that conclusion was arrived at. So thank you very much. I think what you have to do is to be very consistent. And I think objectives where now we are designing the conceptual framework and all that. So consistency is key. And remember, in research, there is no formula, there is no template. Just understand something. Do not just do something because it's done. Just understand, what does it make sense to me? Does it make sense for my study? That's the most important thing. So it's not just a matter of putting it there because it should be there. It's a matter of understanding why should it be there and why do I need it? It helped me to do my research and make particular conclusions. So any last word, Nancy? Then we go to Collins.
I think for me, my parting shot would be the flow of the variables that have been identified, especially when you're reviewing your study. The flow of the variables will now give a lot of strength to it's like the backbone of what you're talking about. The same variables that are in your topic should be the same ones that you're introducing in chapter 1. They should be the same ones that you're talking about in the objectives without changing them or introducing new ones in the objectives, because there's a tendency, or maybe there's some sort of excitement, especially when you're reviewing literature in chapter 2, you find other exciting variables that are sounding rosy, but because you're introducing them at literature level, because you did not have them from the beginning, just leave them out because they're not within the scope of your study. That's not what you're discussing. Then you go all the way. Then when you come to draw now the conceptual framework, you now bring those relationships will come out very clearly. Because anytime you find that you have new concepts or new variables and new constructs coming in, it will either increase your scope of your study or bring a lot of confusion, especially when you're discussing literature review. What do you discuss and what don't you discuss? Because you'll find that you may have a literature review of about even 60 pages because it is too wide. There are variables that were introduced in between that are not part of the original structure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nancy, do we have consent to share your slides?
Yes, please. Go ahead and share them. Share them with you.
Dr. Wangari will share the feedback form so that, okay, someone is saying address qualitative research. If we use conceptual framework, if we don't, what then are we using? Maybe you can quickly answer that as Dr. Wangari shares she'll share the feedback form where we will access your email and send the, so for the qualitative people, what do we do?
For the qualitative people, you use your theoretical framework. If you can't use a conceptual framework, you have to use a theoretical framework. But most researchers nowadays use both theoretical and conceptual, because you want to look at the hypothesis, but at the same time add to the theory, because the theory on its own cannot stand alone. So most of the social sciences use theoretical framework.
Yeah, just to add to what Dr. has said, you'll see, it varies. Always be guided by what does your discipline dictate, and also what does your university guide, what are the guidelines around there. But to just strengthen and, you know, to explain so that nobody punches a lot of holes, especially during defense, the theoretical framework must be there. You have to identify theories and discuss them, whether you're in quantitative or qualitative. It adds a lot of meat and a lot of flesh, and it shows that you've done a lot of reading just to ensure that your argument is solid. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Now we go to Collins Audi. He's going to talk about the research design. So today we are really talking about those critical parts of your paper that if you really stumble in them, you will really have difficulties thereon. So the research design, how do you make a choice about the design? How does the design link to your problem statement? And etc. So Karibu Collins, you're a co-host. You can share your screen.
Thank you, Aurelia. So I'm going to share my screen. Please confirm if you can see my screen.
We can, thank you. Go ahead, introduce yourself and go ahead.
So my camera is a bit dark, sorry for that, apologies for that. So my name is Collins Audi, and I currently work as the Monitoring and Evaluation Associate at HIAS Kenya, an organization which protects and serves refugees. My background is in epidemiology and biostatistics. I hold a Bachelor of Science degree in epidemiology and biostatistics. And I have 2 years of experience in conducting, monitoring, evaluation, and research activities in humanitarian organizations. So I'm going to take us through the research design. So the topics we are going to cover, I'm going to take you through what is a research design, what constitutes a good research design, what are the various types of the research design, because we also need to look at the various types so that you are able to choose the correct design to be able to adequately answer your research questions. And we are also going to look at how to review the research design section. So basically, first, I want us to think of a research design like a house. Say you want to build a house. So you will need first to have an idea of the design you want your house to look like. So the same way to research design is like the overall blueprint of your research. So because of time, we will be moving quite faster. So basically, as defined by Creswell and Plano-Clark, 2007, research design refers to procedures for collecting, analyzing, interpreting, and reporting data in research studies. So it's like the umbrella of all we are going to do to answer all these research questions. So when we formulate a research problem, we should focus on developing a good design to adequately answer the research questions. So what constitutes a good research design? So I think, is someone interfering with the screen? I can see some drawings.
Sorry about that. Let me check
It's
this thing.
okay.
Sorry.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Mm.
So a good design is that one which produces results that correspond to real properties, characteristics, and variations in the physical or social world. So they should be able to correspond to what is really in the real world. So that refers to validity. So I will give an example. If we have a thermometer and we maintain a room temperature and we are measuring temperature using this thermometer at different intervals. So when we get different readings, yet we maintain the temperature, this means that our result might not be valid. So a good design should also minimize bias and maximize the reliability of the data. So bias basically refers to deviation from the truth in your research study. Might be as a result of problems with how you design your data collection tools like questionnaires, interview forms, or even how you sample. And reliability refers to how consistent your design contributes to the results in your study. So you should have consistent results. If we measure these results at different time intervals by different people, are we able to find the like similar results? So a good design should also have adequate sample size or research group to draw an outcome that can be generalized. So we should have like a representative sample. A good design also gives maximum information while minimizing error and provides different aspects of a single problem. So I will take us through different types of study design so that when you have a study, you are able to know which one is the best choice based on what your research questions are. So first, I'm going to take us through the designs based on the duration of study. Based on duration of study, we usually have two main designs. We have cross-sectional studies. These are studies which are conducted at one point in time. For example, you just want to take conduct a 3-month assessment just one time and go and report those results and prepare for publication of your research. So that's 1 point study. What about studies where you can take a longer period of time? So these are called longitudinal studies. So this usually involves, you can't see my screen?
Sorry about that. I was trying to stop the people sharing. Please proceed. You can share now. Sorry about that.
Can you see the screen now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So longitudinal studies are basically studies which are conducted over a long period of time and usually involve repeated measures. For example, we conduct a study, we do an intervention. Before this intervention, we conduct a baseline survey. Then during that baseline survey, we take the baseline measurements. Then we do an intervention. After that intervention, we collect another set of measurements to gauge whether this intervention had an impact. So these are basically called longitudinal studies. They involve repeated measures and are conducted over a long period of time. For example, in epidemiology, in my field, we do have cohort and case control studies. So I'm going to take us through study design based on nature or purpose of the study. First, we have the descriptive studies. As the name suggests, descriptive basically means we are describing the situation the way it is. We are not going into more details like testing relationships between variables and other details. So descriptive studies are studies concerned with describing the characteristics of something, individual or a group. So they generate hypotheses. For example, if we do a descriptive study, for instance, in a town in Kenya, and we find out that we have many people who are developing cervical cancer, then we might start developing a hypothesis on what are the causes of cancer in this area. So we might start coming up with hypotheses. Maybe there's a specific kind of culture that is taking place there. So they basically help us develop hypotheses. So they answer 4 main questions: who, what, who, where, and when. So what basically means, oh, sorry. So we have sample descriptive research questions. Like, for instance, on what question? What are the boda motorcycle related crimes in Kenya? So that is a what question. We need to describe the crimes or give the estimates of the various crimes committed by the motorcyclist. So on who, an example of a research question: who are the perpetrators and victims of boda motorcycle related crimes? That's the person. On where, for example, a research question may be, where are the boda motorcycle related crimes common in Kenya? So that's a place. Then we can answer a question on when. When do most boda motorcycle related crimes take place in Kenya? So I hope we've understood what a descriptive study basically entails. We are just describing the situation the way they are. Then after that, that takes us to the analytical or explanatory studies. Now, after we start to generate some hypotheses, after we've known the situation on the ground, we come up with now we want to test this hypothesis. So the best design to test this hypothesis is now called the analytical or explanatory studies. So this is a continuation of descriptive research. The researcher goes beyond merely describing these characteristics to analyze and explain why or how something is happening. Hence, analytical research aims to understand phenomena by measuring causal relation among them. So it tries to measure the relationship between various variables. Sample analytical hypotheses or questions. Test hypothesis, for example, daily exposure to sun leads to increased level of happiness. Now we want to test this hypothesis. And a research question may be, why are people with sorry, I think there is a mistake there. I wanted to say plants. Why are plants with why are plants which are frequently exposed to sun? I think I had a confusion there, sorry. So like from this, we might say, why are people with frequent exposure to sun happier than those with less exposure? So that's a sample research. So we first talked about the longitudinal or cross-sectional studies. A cross-sectional study can both be descriptive and analytic. We can have a one-point study testing associations or relationship between variables, or have a one-point study just describing the situation of that problem. Then we have exploratory studies. Maybe we have a research problem where little has been done. We've not understand deeper about this problem. So that this is where exploratory studies comes in. So it aims to provide the final and conclusive answers to the research questions, but merely explores the research topic with varying levels of depth. Its theme is to tackle new problems on which little or no previous research has been done. So it adds more on what has been done. So additionally, it is used when we have a research question that is not clearly understood or defined. So some exploratory research question, for example, what factors influence mental health in undergraduates, maybe in a particular university? So say this is an open question where the person has to talk about the details of this. Then we have the experimental studies. They are used to test causal relationships, but involves manipulation of variables. Manipulation basically means we assign an intervention. For example, we are in the medical field, for instance, we are testing the effect of a new drug, maybe on outcomes of cancer patients. Now we are trying to manipulate maybe the size of tumors, for example. That might be an independent variable. So for instance, we manipulate, we give the drugs and placebo and try to manipulate the size of tumors and see if what is the effect of this. So subjects are randomly assigned to groups. We have the treatment and control groups, for example. So it is usually conducted in a controlled environment, for example, in a laboratory. So experimental study example, how does the amount of light affect how tall a plant grows? So we have two variables here. How does amount of light is the independent variable. Then how tall a plant grows, or the height, is now the dependent variable. So if we manipulate the amount of light, the way we were saying we manipulate the independent variable. If we manipulate the amount of light and see how does it affect the growth of that plant or the height, then the best study design there is called an experimental study. So to conduct this study, a researcher may assign plants into two groups, control and treatment groups. So control consists of plants not exposed to light. Treatment consists of plants exposed to light. Then now we are trying to compare these two groups. So because of time, I must not go into the details of other study designs, mainly in the qualitative research. We have the case studies, ethnography, grounded theories, and phenomenology. You can read more about them. I will also share the resources on where you can find the study designs. So how to review the study design? First, you have to reflect on the research question and objectives. Try to understand your questions. What are the questions that you are trying to answer? Then check whether the selected type of research design is well aligned with the approach, and whether it will adequately answer the research question. So a research approach may be, for instance, qualitative or quantitative. So then the choice of design will influence the research approach. For instance, if we choose exploratory, we might use a mixed method approach. So a mixed method approach is like mixing both quantitative tools with qualitative. An example of a qualitative tool is questionnaire, a quantitative questionnaire. Then an example or examples of qualitative tools include the focus group discussions and key informant interviews. Also check whether there's a possibility of bias based on the sampling methods and procedures. You have to use the correct sampling methods and procedures. And sampling will depend on the number of samples that you are going to have and the outcomes you are going to have in your study. Also check whether research questions are likely to measure the research objectives, the validity. You should arrange these questions by objectives and ensure that they measure exactly these objectives. Also check whether the data analysis plan is correct. For example, for a descriptive study, we may decide to use graph frequencies, descriptive statistics. However, for analytic studies, because we are testing some relationships and associations, we can use both descriptive and inferential statistics. Examples of inferential methods include the ANOVA, t-test, regression methods, but I won't go into details about that. So we have a example of a choice of a study design. For instance, this particular study was called a quasi-experimental study. So the study will employ a quasi-experimental pre and post comparison study design. I know the terms might be quite difficult to understand, but basically it's a design under the experimental approach. But we won't go into details of different types of experiments. So the study will employ quasi-experimental pre and post comparison study design because one, remember we talked about the manipulation of independent variables, because it involves manipulation of independent variables without randomization. So a quasi-experiment basically involves no randomization, but we are manipulating the variables. So you have to justify why you are choosing this particular study design. So then go ahead and talk of the approaches you are going to use, whether both quantitative and qualitative. So for instance, you say it will utilize quantitative and qualitative approaches to evaluate change in behavior in relation to road safety among motorcyclists in Nairobi County. So thank you. Basically, that's what I had for today. Study design is a wide topic and we might not be able to discuss everything by today, but I've taken you through the basic types of study design so that you have an idea on what design to choose when you are conducting your research. So most of my reference were from one of the most referenced research methodology books called Research Methodology, Methods and Techniques, written by C.R. Kothari, 2004, the second revised edition. So that's the end of my presentation, unless any of you has a question.
Thank you very much, Collins, for that presentation. We have learned quite a bit on research designs, which are very critical in our study. And choosing the right design for the right research question is very important, or for the right objectives is very important. So now we are opening for questions. Also give comment, which is your research design that you're currently, that you've chosen for your study. Put it there. Let's know the kind of designs people are having. Are you having challenges with aligning it to the research question, such that someone tells you the way this research question will not be answered the type of design that you want to undertake. So a lot of thank yous coming in. Good job, Collins. And as we say that Aid Africa, anyone can be, there is no, knowledge does not rest with anyone. So even Collins, we really thank you. Even at the level of your bachelor's, you've really been able to really take us through very well in an area that troubles many researchers, many of us researchers. So we've gone a bit over time. So I would ask any questions that are coming in, please. I haven't seen any, that's why I'm talking. So a lot of thank yous. My design, Stephen says, is cross-sectional study design. And yes, now we know how we are going to justify it, what kind of approaches or what kind of methods go with cross-sectional. Thank you. Liz says, my design is explanatory because the duration is both cross-sectional and longitudinal. That is panel data. Good. So I see there is quite a good, yeah. So this is, so because Colin said there's quite a lot to learn about designs and is given a reference. So just go to the reference and the designs that you're thinking about, go and check them. Oh, I'm thinking of a descriptive study, of which sometimes they're discouraged these days at master's and PhD. Don't do descriptive studies. Do more of analytical studies that are answering to the question of why and how, rather than what questions. Mina is asking, what is cross-sectional? So maybe you can unpack the idea of cross-sectional itself. Why is it called a cross-sectional study? Caroline says HAS is quasi-experimental. Mina is talking of HAS is descriptive. Yes. So I think that's the main question. Please fill in the feedback form because that's how we will get your email address to be able to send you the notes. The link is on chat. So Collins, would you unpack a bit about what is cross-sectional?
So as we discussed earlier, a cross-sectional study is basically a study that we conduct at one point in time. It's like we do a single measurement of that research. We don't do repeated measurements. For instance, you are conducting a survey on knowledge, attitude, and practices of boda riders in Nairobi City. We are going to conduct this study in one point in time. We are not going to keep on doing measurements to assess the knowledge, attitude, and practices. We are going to measure it once. Even if it takes 3 months or 4 months, it is a one-time study. So the main difference with the longitudinal is that in longitudinal, we might have repeated measures. And mostly this is mostly in cohort, case control, or experimental studies, where we try to follow up on some outcomes over a period of time, or we follow up the impact of an intervention over a period of time. But for the case of cross-sectional, we just conduct the measurement at one point. You write your research report, and you don't conduct any other measurement again. So basically, it's a one point in time study. So is that clear, or you need more clarifications on that?
Thank you, Collins, for that. Let's see a few more. Great. Mina says great. Yes, and so now you have that understanding. And also, I think it's also the type of studies that are done a lot by consultants, which is just go to one place, do a study at one time and go across different populations. So it's also across the populations as well. So,
and also to add on something, can I add something, please?
Collins.
You can find, for instance, we can have a design like a cross-sectional descriptive study. We can also have a design like cross-sectional analytic. That goes into more details. It is cross-sectional, yes, but specifically it falls under what? Descriptive or analytic. So you can also be that specific. Yes.
Thank you. Really, that was very insightful. Any other questions? Because now we are exactly across different populations and issues. Yeah, so the cross-sectional aspect. So any other questions? If there is none, do you have anything to conclude, Collins? Then we can call it a great learning day.
I think up to that point, I have nothing more to add, but I will just encourage you to go and read on that book. It's really a good book if you want to understand the different research designs and methodologies, including data collection tools that you may consider using in different study designs, the different approaches and why you may need to choose them. So I will share the link to that book in the group, even though I'm not in that group. Who is the admin of the group?
We will share that.
Wangare?
Okay, I will share with Dr. Wangari, who can share with you in the group. So mine is also to appreciate you for sacrificing your time to let us take you through the different parts of research. And I'm hoping to have more conversations with you. It was actually not interactive, I think, because of time, but next time I hope we might interact more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Collins. And for us, we also count chats as being interactive. So the chats were quite 1,000. There are very many chats. But yes, I think next time we will have maybe one presenter and then there's time for people to unmute and talk. But thank you, Collins. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Fozia. Such a pleasure making time to really give us great insights. We are better researchers today because of you and the input you have given us. So from Ada Africa, my name is Aurelia Monene, working together with Dr. Joyce Wangare and other great mentors whom you can find on our website. We are dedicated to really transforming and research in Africa, where we want Africans to lead the research in the continent. Remember, Africa is one of the most researched continents in the world, but research in Africa is not led by African researchers. So we want to reclaim that space. And one way of reclaiming it is to make sure that we ourselves are competent researchers so that we can lead the conversations around our stories and what is happening in the continent. So thank you for coming. Please fill in the feedback form so that you can share with you the resources, and we wish you a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Kwaheri. See you in another webinar.
Thank you very much and bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So I'll just hang around a bit for people who want the link to the feedback form. You can leave it. Wangare, do we have all we need?
Yes, I believe so. We are good to go.
Good people, take care. See you soon.